Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to go through the business report question for the 2017 HSC. We're going to break down the question, the stimulus, and the individual part. So we've got here Sportyz Goods, Sportyz Goods. So what I might do is that I don't want to write down Sportyz Goods every single time I'm writing this. So I might say, okay, so Sportyz Goods, what I'll do is after the first time I write it, I'll put down SG. So it's a retailer, right? So it sells the goods, been operating for the past 20 years in Australia. And then the directors of the business have given us the following information. Okay, so in 2013, the business issued new shares. So we can tell by that, and also the LTD part here, is that Sportyz Goods is a public company. So we might look for opportunities to discuss that in terms of issuing new shares or in terms of capital raisings to see if that's relevant, and expanded its retail activities internationally. So we know that this is not just an Australian operation, that it actually exists overseas as well. The business is facing increased competition, that here we might think about, okay, increased competition, so that is external to the business. It is not helpful, but is harmful. And that if we go back to our SWOT analysis, that this is very much a threat. And that might be helpful in terms of our discussion. The directors are concerned about the positioning of their product in the market. So their positioning, that very specific language, that to me involves marketing, how we position our product against the competition, that in terms of elements with the competition, that we can also think back to the stimulus and be like, ooh, competition-based pricing relative to the competition. Okay, that might be something that's relevant, who knows. The directors want the business to operate for the benefit of shareholders in the long term. So that here seems like a bit of a goal or an objective of the business, that they want to see it operate for the benefits of shareholders. And that if I think about what is in the benefit of shareholders, that it really relates to profitability, right? Because the shareholders are getting a share of that profit in the form of their dividends. So that if we're thinking about a business operating for the benefit of shareholders, well, then it needs to be profitable. Otherwise, shareholders won't get a return. We've now got here a discussion here. We can see that 2013, that we know that that's when they issued new shares. And then sales have gone up and then sales have come down. So that what we can see is that very much profitability is declining, and that what we can also think about is that, okay, so profit, that equals revenue or sales minus expenses, right? So that if we think about here, that the gap between these things here is rising expenses, because if we've got revenue and we've got profit, then that's the thing that's missing here. And then if we think about it, okay, so what do we actually have to write about? What are the key parts of this business report? So here are the three components we need to do. I found this first part very tricky. We'll see what you think. Outline one strategic role of financial management. And that the key part here though is it has to be really focused on Sportyz Goods. If I talk about one strategic role of financial management, it could be quite broad. So we really want it to be very focused. The other thing is to recommend two strategies to improve financial performance. So here we'd be thinking about, okay, well, one of the key goals for this business would be profitability. And that would give us specific profitability strategies. And then the final point here is to explain the importance of monitoring and controlling the business's marketing strategy. Three big chunky elements. What we'll do now is we'll go into how we would address each of these. So what we'll say is we'll go, in terms of this, we'll go, okay, so this will be section 1. This can be section 2 with that color, and then this would be section 3. Okay, so let's start with section 1 over here. So that if I'm looking at the heading for this section, I might say, okay, so the heading would be, okay, the strategic underline. Let's zoom in a little bit. Okay, so I find this part really tricky. I spent ages thinking about how would I actually answer this part. What am I trying to say? Because that it's not looking at the objectives of financial management, which have a clear number in terms of the syllabus. It's really looking at what is the strategic role of financial management in the context of Sportyz Goods. So the kind of things that I think about is that when we are talking about the strategic role of financial management, that the kind of thing we're thinking about are the long-term financial goals. That's just my abbreviation for shareholders. I probably wouldn't use that in an exam. And that the benefit for shareholders comes from the business being profitable, because that is where they will draw their return in terms of the dividends. Sorry, one way that I would think about then is that if we look at specifically for Sportyz Goods, we know that it has declining profitability, that the profit has been steadily falling and that there is increased competition. So that if I'm trying to provide some answer or context for this, we might say, okay, well then a key strategic role of financial management, and that if we are providing a bit of context to that, is that, I'll just put this in white here, is that if we are trying to increase profitability, that we really have two options, right? So we know that profit, increase revenue, and or reduce expenses. So that would be the strategic role here, would be to find ways to improve revenue and or reduce expenses. And that by doing these steps here, that we can increase profit and increase the return to shareholders. So like I said, I found that section particularly tricky. If you have any better ideas, then please put them in the comments. I'm not the sole expert here or even an expert necessarily. So that if I'm trying to finish off this section here, so I would say, okay, so what we might need to say here is that, okay, so for Sportyz Goods, and that you could put this also in the bigger context as well from the stimulus of the kind of idea of, okay, well, we've got rising competition and we have got rising expenses. If we do a quick recap, is that what I'm saying is that, okay, so the overall heading for this part is the strategic role of financial management. We focus on profitability and what the business would need to do. Because if you look at the language of the question here, you are outlining one strategic role of financial management. One strategic role would be to improve profitability by looking at the revenue and expenses side. I have my handy notes. The second part here would be 2 strategies to improve financial performance. This is more straightforward. I think we've got blue. If we look at the language of the question, that we're very much looking at that recommend part. So we need to provide some reasoning justification why the business should put in place these 2 strategies to improve financial performance. So if we're thinking about what the heading would be for this section, is that I would keep it pretty straightforward. So I would say here, strategies, pretty straightforward there. So if I'm thinking about the goal in terms of financial performance, that we could focus again on saying, okay, well, it's really important for this business to improve profitability for the reasons that we have talked about in the previous section. And so we can say that to improve profitability, that there are really those 2 options, and that we can take this language specifically from the syllabus. So we could talk about revenue controls, and then we can talk about expense minimization. And we are going to do this in the context of Sportyz Goods. We are trying to make this as specific as possible, so that if I'm trying to set this up then, is that would be section 2.1 and that would be section 2.2. And we'll do them a little bit more here. So if I go section 2.1 here, that my heading would probably be something along the lines of strategy 1. If I look at the syllabus, that in terms of revenue controls, that the focus is very much in looking at marketing objectives. So if I'm trying to put this together and to make sense of it, is that I know that from the stimulus, the business itself is concerned about how it is positioned. And we also know that there is rising competition. And the other thing that I would think about is that in order to increase revenue, that we're trying to look at ways that how can we actually boost sales, is that I might think about, well, what about competition-based pricing? And the reason that I suggest this is because that's a very nice connection back to positioning, because then we can say, well, how do we want to be positioned relative to the competition versus the competition? Do we want to be seen as more premium? Do we want to be more competitive with price? So what we could say is we could say, all right, well, if we were looking at this, what if we undercut the competition with the goal of boosting sales and very much lifting revenue and trying to solve some of the issues that the business is experiencing? So yes, there are going to be some issues with this, but that what the kind of overall point we might make here is that by doing this, we could potentially increase sales. We know this business is experiencing rising expenses. So if it can avoid having to spend a bunch more money, then it probably should do that. And that if we implement competition-based pricing in order to boost sales, that this might be a way to do it. But this is not a perfect strategy, unfortunately. That there are issues with taking this kind of approach. So that if we scroll out a little bit and we make that a little bit bigger, is that one thing you could think about is that if we do this with competition-based pricing, and we do that, is that we could also think, yeah, but what are the quality implications of this? And what I mean by that is if we tell the market that, okay, now we have lower prices, does that mean that we have reduced quality? Do the consumers view the product differently? So that could this actually worsen the positioning of the brand? So that, yes, we have boosted sales, but has that come at the expense of our position, that we are now seen as maybe quite cheap and low quality? We don't know really what the current positioning is of Sporty Goods. Maybe it would be fine to be seen as this, but that could be something that could happen, and that I would absolutely mention this. It doesn't undermine your argument to present a different perspective, because if you think about Sportyz Goods, they would really like to know your honest opinion. So you say, okay, so we know that we need to boost revenue, and that what we're saying is that we can boost revenue and help with the positioning potentially by doing competition-based pricing and undercutting the competition, charging less than the competition. The advantage here is that we could boost sales without marketing campaigns needing to be implemented. But there is a trade-off or a cost in terms of quality implications. If we reduce the price, will consumers think that we have reduced quality, which could worsen positioning? But the overall approach is one you could discuss, saying we recommend that in terms of revenue controls, the business does competition-based pricing and attempts to undercut the competition. So if we think about our second strategy then, if we've talked about the revenue side of things, then section 2.2 could be very much about the cost side of things. So what we're saying here is that by reducing its expenses, that Sportyz Goods can improve profitability, because remember this section is about the strategies to improve financial performance. So here we are trying to look at ways to improve profitability. One thing we could do is to increase expenses. That would be pretty dumb. To reduce expenses. Now, the syllabus hasn't given us a lot of specifics about the business in terms of where the expenses are occurring. So we need to do a little bit of guesswork, a little bit of interpretation in terms of this. So that if we're thinking about ways to reduce expenses, well, we could think about, okay, so we know that labor is a major cost for businesses. What we could do is we could say, okay, so how can we reduce wages? So we could, reduce the headcount for the business, and that is a euphemism for firing people. The other thing that we could do is maybe we could employ more flexible workers, so that maybe we could employ more casuals, less full-time staff and all the expenses that they have in terms of that. Maybe we could look at, in terms of this, could we replace with technology? And you could say that, yes, in the long term, that could save money, but big upfront expenses, which Sportyz may not be willing to pay for. The other thing is that maybe we could look at the rents that are paid for retail outlets, so that we could say, okay, so here is a large fixed cost for the business, doesn't vary with the level of production. And so we could say, well, maybe you could change, that's delta, we could change the location of retail outlets with the goal of reducing rents and further bringing down expenses, right? I'm just trying to put the clues together from the stimulus. And then the other thing that we could think about in terms of costs is that, okay, so it's producing goods, sporty goods, obviously. So maybe we could look at, well, in terms of the inputs into production, could we reduce the cost of inputs? So could we renegotiate with suppliers? Maybe we could even change suppliers if we can get better deals. The other thing which I think would be interesting to talk about is that we know that Sportyz operates globally. So could we get involved in a bit of global sourcing to find the lowest cost suppliers? Let's move that because my head's probably blocking that. Lowest cost. And all of those things would be ways in terms of reducing our expenses. So again, haven't had a huge amount to work with in terms of specific business elements in the stimulus, but what I've been able to do is think about, well, I know that labor is a big cost. I know that rent is an important fixed cost, and all businesses have inputs, and that if I can reduce the cost of inputs, then that here can improve profitability because that's reducing expenses. So if I scroll out, maybe not that far, so I go to this second section here, so you can see I've got my strategies to improve financial performance. I'm looking at revenue controls. I'm looking at cutting costs. So here we're saying implementation, monitoring, and controlling, right? So that here it says explain the importance of monitoring and controlling the business's marketing strategy. So it is specifically looking at the marketing strategy, not operations, looking at monitoring and controlling that. I feel like I've made that point. Okay, so here, if I go, this part is from the syllabus. So that here it's about developing a financial forecast, comparing actual and planned results, and revising the marketing strategy if necessary. So what I'll do is provide a kind of overall approach, why this is important. So that the importance of this step is that what we can do is we set our goals and then we compare the actual to planned results. And that what we can then do is take corrective action, and that is the controlling part. And that the reason why corrective action is so important is that we can redirect spending from strategies that is not working to then better ones. So then we can ensure the money is spent efficiently, it is not wasted, and that the money is spent effectively. So on programs that actually help the business. So that if we're looking at this part of the question again, is that we're looking at what is the importance of monitoring and controlling. Well, the importance is that we need to set goals, compare the actual to planned results, and change action so that money isn't wasted. And if we're looking at in terms of Sportyz Goods, that it needs to understand whether its marketing strategies are actually helpful or hindering its progress. And if they are unhelpful, to then redirect that spending. So that we need to monitor and then correct. Because if we are wasting money here in this step, that the real risk is that profitability will further worsen. And we already know that that is a challenge. If there are any questions or issues about this, particularly about that outline 1 strategic role of financial management, please do put them in the comments. If you've made it this far, wow, I'm very impressed. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.